The day my own daughter looked straight into my eyes and said, "Get the janitor out before he embarrasses us." She had no idea she was throwing the real owner out of the hospital built in her mother's memory. By the end of that week, everything she had spent years building would come crashing down. Please, before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. My name is William Carter, and until that morning, I believed there wasn't a mistake my daughter could make that love couldn't forgive. I was wrong. The lobby of St. Evelyn Medical Center shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, while nearly 300 guests laughed beneath towering flower arrangements, and television cameras captured every smiling face. Politicians shook hands with wealthy donors. Doctors proudly posed for photographs. Reporters rehearsed their introductions for the evening news. Everyone had come to celebrate the grand opening of what newspapers were already calling the most advanced private hospital in western Pennsylvania. I stood quietly near the entrance, wearing gray maintenance coveralls, a faded name tag that read, "William Facilities," and a pair of worn work boots that had seen better days. In one hand I held a mop, in the other I carried a small toolbox. No one paid much attention to the old janitor wiping away footprints from the polished marble floor. That was exactly how I wanted it. 6 months earlier, I had taken this job because I wanted to see what this hospital had become after I stepped away. I never imagined the hardest thing to clean inside this building wouldn't be the floors. It would be the stain left on my own family. As I finished drying a puddle near the VIP reception area, I heard expensive heels clicking across the marble behind me. "Seriously?" a familiar voice snapped. "Who let maintenance work in here during the ceremony?" I turned around slowly. "Claire." My daughter. She looked stunning in an ivory business suit with a gold hospital pin fastened to her lapel, smiling for cameras only seconds before her expression hardened the moment she recognized me. Her husband Nathan stood beside her, adjusting his designer tie, while several investors waited only a few feet away. Claire walked closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound polite, but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I offered a gentle smile. "Working." She glanced at my uniform, then toward the group of donors watching the exchange. Embarrassment spread across her face like wildfire. "I told you not to come near the front today." An elderly patient spilled coffee. I answered calmly, "I was just cleaning it before someone slipped." Nathan sighed impatiently before muttering, "This is exactly why I said he shouldn't be on staff today." Claire looked toward the head of security, then back at me. For a brief second, I thought she might remember who I was before she remembered who everyone else expected her to be. Instead, she pointed directly at me and said the words that silenced every conversation within earshot. "Get the janitor out of here before he embarrasses us." The security guards hesitated. One of them looked at me with obvious sympathy, while another glanced nervously between Claire and the growing crowd. I didn't move. "Claire," I said quietly, "are you sure this is how you want to remember today?" She folded her arms. "You're making a scene, Dad." Nathan stepped beside her and spoke to security with the confidence of a man who believed power belonged to him forever. "Escort him out through the service entrance. Our guests don't need this distraction." One guard approached carefully. "Sir, I'm sorry. We'll have to ask you to leave." I nodded slowly, setting the mop against the wall before reaching into my toolbox. Instead of arguing, I pulled out a weathered envelope addressed in my late wife's handwriting. I looked at the hospital bearing her name one last time, before quietly slipping the envelope back inside. "All right," I whispered. "Let's see whether this building still remembers the promise it was built on." Then I turned toward the exit without another word, unaware that someone standing near the back of the lobby had witnessed everything, and was already reaching for a phone that would change all of our lives forever. 6 months before my daughter ordered security to remove me from St. Evelyn Medical Center, I walked into the same building through the employee entrance, wearing the same gray coveralls and carrying a lunchbox Eleanor had given me 37 years earlier. Back then, the hospital was still under construction. The lobby floors were covered with protective paper, and the polished brass letters spelling out Evelyn's name had not yet been mounted above the entrance. No one recognized me. That was intentional. My name is William Carter, and for most of my adult life, people knew me as the founder of Carter Development Group, one of the largest construction and real estate firms in Pennsylvania. I had designed office towers, restored historic neighborhoods, and negotiated contracts worth more money than I ever felt comfortable saying out loud. But after Evelyn died, none of that mattered much to me. I sold the company, placed most of the proceeds into a charitable foundation, and disappeared from the business pages before anyone noticed I was gone. Claire told people I had retired because grief had made me tired. Nathan preferred a different version. According to him, I had become forgetful, withdrawn, and incapable of handling complicated decisions. Neither of them knew I was still reading every financial report connected to the hospital. They also did not know I had stopped trusting those reports. The numbers always looked perfect. Donations increased. Operating costs remained stable. Executive bonuses were described as performance incentives. Every department appeared fully staffed and properly funded. But anonymous complaints arriving at the Evelyn Carter Foundation told another story. Nurses working double shifts without overtime, patients being turned away because their insurance was considered inconvenient, medical supplies disappearing from departments that served low-income families. The final complaint came from someone who wrote only one sentence. The free care wing is being closed quietly, and no one is allowed to ask why. Evelyn had made me promise that wing would remain open as long as the hospital carried her name. That was when I decided reports were no longer enough. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. The facilities department was hiring temporary workers, so I applied under my full legal name and listed only the jobs I had held before starting my company. Construction laborer, maintenance supervisor, building inspector. Nobody in human resources looked closely enough to connect William Carter, age 69, with the foundation whose name appeared on half the hospital paperwork. To them, I was simply an older widower looking for part-time work. My supervisor, a tired man named Luis Mendoza, handed me a uniform and said, "The pay isn't great, but if you show up on time and don't complain, we'll get along." I shook his hand and replied, "That sounds fair." For the next 6 months, I cleaned hallways, replaced light fixtures, repaired broken cabinet doors, and listened. People speak honestly around janitors because they assume we are invisible. I heard administrators complain that charity patients occupied beds needed for profitable procedures. I heard Nathan tell a department head to delay replacing faulty equipment until after the donor gala because appearance matters more than function this quarter. I watched Claire walk through pediatric wards surrounded by photographers, then ignore the same children when the cameras were gone. Still, I searched for excuses. She was under pressure. She was tired. Nathan was influencing her. Fathers can build entire shelters out of excuses when the truth outside feels too cold. The only person who treated me the same, whether anyone was watching or not, was a young nurse named Maya Reynolds. The first time we met, she found me kneeling beside a broken wheelchair near the emergency department. "You shouldn't be doing that alone," she said, setting down her charts. "That wheel assembly is heavy." "I've lifted worse," I told her. She smiled. That's what stubborn men always say right before they hurt their backs. Then she crouched beside me and held the frame steady until I finished the repair. She never asked why an old maintenance worker knew how to fix almost anything. She simply thanked me and pushed the wheelchair toward a patient waiting near the wall. Over time, Maya began leaving coffee beside my cart during night shifts. She told me which elevators failed, which rooms had leaking pipes, and which patients needed blankets even when supply managers said none were available. One evening, I asked her about the hospital's free care wing. Her expression changed immediately. "There is no free care wing anymore," she said quietly. "Administration calls it a temporary closure, but they moved the nurses, transferred the patients, and removed the signs." "Who authorized it?" I asked. Maya glanced toward the security camera above us, before lowering her voice. "Mr. Cole signed the order. Your daughter approved it." The words struck harder than I expected. I followed Maya down a restricted corridor to the hospital's east wing, where 2 locked glass doors stood beneath a blank section of wall. I could still see the pale outlines where the words Evelyn Carter Community Care had once been mounted. Behind the glass sat empty beds, boxed equipment, and dark examination rooms that had been built with money Evelyn left specifically for people who had nowhere else to go. Taped to one door was a construction notice describing the space as a future executive wellness center. I stood there for a long time without speaking. Maya watched me carefully. "Are you all right, William?" I placed my hand against the cold glass and saw my reflection staring back at me in a janitor's uniform. "No," I said, "but I finally understand why I needed to come here." What I did not tell her was that the locked wing was only the first broken promise I would uncover, and the next one carried my daughter's signature. Standing in front of the locked doors of the abandoned community care wing, I couldn't stop staring at the empty hallway behind the glass. Just 6 years earlier, Evelyn had stood in that exact spot wearing a hospital gown instead of a business suit, smiling through the pain as she pointed toward a set of unfinished blueprints spread across my lap. "Promise me one thing, William," she whispered. "If we ever build this hospital, no one will ever be asked how much money they have before they're asked what's hurting." I smiled back then and squeezed her hand. "You have my word." She closed her eyes for a moment before adding something I didn't fully understand until much later. "People remember beautiful buildings for a little while. They remember kindness for the rest of their lives." Evelyn had always been the better half of both our marriage and our business. While I focused on concrete, steel, permits, and budgets, she focused on people. She knew the names of receptionists, janitors, security guards, and cafeteria workers. She baked cookies for construction crews every Christmas, and somehow remembered every employee's birthday without writing any of them down. Our company built office towers, schools, retirement homes, and libraries across 3 states. But whenever newspapers interviewed us, Evelyn always redirected the conversation away from profits and toward the families those buildings would serve. "Buildings are easy," she liked to say. "The people inside them are the real investment." When she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer, she never complained about the treatments or the pain. The only thing that truly broke her heart happened during one of her chemotherapy sessions. In the bed beside hers lay a single mother who quietly apologized to the nurse because she couldn't afford another treatment. I still remember the look on Evelyn's face after that woman was discharged early. She didn't cry in the hospital room. She waited until we reached the parking lot, then sat inside the car with both hands covering her face. "No one should have to choose between staying alive and keeping their family from going bankrupt," she whispered. That night, she spread architectural sketches across our dining room table and began drawing ideas of her own. They weren't technical drawings. They were dreams. A children's garden outside the pediatric wing. Comfortable family rooms where relatives could sleep beside loved ones. A chapel with no religious symbols, so everyone would feel welcome. Most importantly, an entire floor dedicated to treating patients regardless of insurance, income, or social status. "Call it the community care wing," she said with a hopeful smile. "People won't remember my name on the building. They'll remember how they were treated inside it." I promised her I would make it happen, never imagining I would one day have to protect that promise from my own family. Evelyn passed away 11 months later. The morning after her funeral, I walked into my office, gathered the executive board, and announced I was selling Carter Development Group. Some of them thought grief had clouded my judgment. Others begged me to reconsider. But no amount of profit mattered anymore. Every dollar from that sale became the foundation of the Evelyn Carter Foundation, a charitable trust created for one purpose: building the hospital she had dreamed about during those final months. Claire stood beside me through every meeting in those early years. She cried when the first steel beams were raised. She hugged construction workers after the final inspection passed. On the day we placed the bronze letters spelling St. Evelyn Medical Center above the entrance, she wrapped her arms around me and said, "Mom would be so proud." I believed her with all my heart. As the hospital grew, I slowly stepped away from daily operations. Claire had earned a master's degree in healthcare administration, and I genuinely believed she was ready to lead. Nathan had recently joined the executive team as chief financial officer. He spoke confidently about expansion, partnerships, efficiency, and growth. I assumed his ambition would strengthen Claire's compassion. Instead, it slowly replaced it. Every quarterly report looked better than the last. Donations increased. Revenue climbed. Awards filled the lobby walls. Yet something invisible began disappearing from the building Evelyn had imagined. Volunteers quietly stopped coming. Charity programs became temporary budget adjustments. Community outreach events were canceled because they generated no measurable financial return. Whenever I questioned those decisions, Nathan always had polished spreadsheets proving they were necessary. Claire defended every recommendation he made. "Dad," she would tell me with a patient smile, "healthcare is different now. We have to think like a business if we want to survive." I wanted to believe she was right. I wanted to believe compromise was simply part of leadership. But standing outside that abandoned community care wing, looking through the glass at rows of empty hospital beds built with Evelyn's final dream, I realized something that chilled me more than anything I had discovered so far. My daughter hadn't simply forgotten her mother's promise. She had replaced it with someone else's priorities, and if Nathan had convinced her to betray the very reason this hospital existed. I had to find out what else they were hiding before there was nothing left of Evelyn's legacy to save. 3 days after I discovered the community care wing had been quietly shut down, Claire called me for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Her voice sounded warmer than it had in months. "Dad," she said, "why don't you come over for dinner tomorrow night? It's been too long." For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe she missed me. Fathers are remarkably good at confusing hope with evidence. I arrived at her house just before 6 carrying a homemade apple pie, the same recipe Evelyn had baked every Thanksgiving. The front door opened before I could knock twice. Claire smiled, hugged me quickly, and thanked me for coming. Nathan greeted me from the dining room with a glass of expensive wine already in his hand. The house was beautiful, far larger than anything Claire had grown up in, but somehow it felt strangely empty. Everything looked carefully arranged, as if no one actually lived there. We spent the first half hour talking about harmless things. The weather, the hospital's successful fundraising campaign, my part-time maintenance job. Claire asked whether my back still bothered me after long shifts. Nathan joked that I should retire before I accidentally fixed the entire hospital by myself. I laughed politely, though something about the evening felt rehearsed. Every compliment arrived too perfectly. Every smile lingered a second too long. Then dinner ended, Nathan cleared his throat, and the real reason I had been invited finally appeared. He returned carrying a leather portfolio and placed it carefully on the dining table between us. "Nothing complicated," he said with an easy smile. "Just a little paperwork we've been meaning to organize." Claire avoided looking directly at me. "It's simply estate planning, Dad. Rebecca always told us paperwork should be updated every few years." Rebecca Sloan had indeed said that many times, which was exactly why Nathan chose her name. He wanted the request to sound familiar. I opened the folder slowly. The first few pages looked harmless, enough medical contact information, emergency notifications, routine legal updates. Then I reached the documents hidden farther inside. My pulse slowed instead of racing. Years in business had taught me one valuable lesson. If someone wants you to sign quickly, read twice as slowly. Buried beneath ordinary forms sat a durable power of attorney, transferring financial authority to Claire. Another document declared that if 2 physicians determined I showed signs of cognitive decline, control of every voting interest connected to the Evelyn Carter Foundation would immediately pass to her. The next page authorized the sale of my farmhouse if it was considered no longer suitable for the principal's health and safety. Finally, I found a neurological evaluation already partially completed. My personal information had been typed in. The physician's signature appeared at the bottom. Only one space remained blank. Mine. I looked up quietly. "You think I'm losing my memory?" Claire reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "Dad, nobody wants this. But lately you've been working as a janitor when you don't need the money. You spend your evenings fixing broken wheelchairs instead of relaxing. People are starting to worry." Nathan leaned back confidently. "This isn't about taking anything from you. It's about protecting you before someone else takes advantage." I studied his face for several silent seconds. His expression never changed. He truly believed I would sign without asking another question. "And if I don't?" I asked calmly. Nathan answered before Claire could speak. "Then the court eventually becomes involved. That process is unpleasant for everyone." There it was. Not concern. Not love. A threat wrapped in polite language. Claire lowered her eyes. She still hadn't defended me once. Instead, she whispered, "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. The word echoed inside my head. Building the hospital had been hard. Watching my wife die had been hard. Standing outside the locked community care wing had been hard. This was simply disappointing. I picked up the pen. Nathan couldn't hide the small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. Claire finally looked relieved. I slowly signed the acknowledgement page, confirming I had received copies of the documents, but I deliberately left every transfer of authority completely unsigned. Then I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I'll have Rebecca review everything before I make any decisions." Nathan's smile disappeared instantly. "That's really unnecessary." "Maybe," I replied pleasantly. "But old men like me sometimes need extra time to remember what we're signing." Neither of them laughed. After another awkward 10 minutes, I thanked Claire for dinner, hugged her goodbye, and drove home beneath a sky heavy with approaching rain. Halfway to my truck, I realized I had forgotten my toolbox in the hallway. When I quietly stepped back inside through the unlocked side entrance, voices drifted from the dining room before either of them noticed I had returned. Nathan sounded irritated. One signature, that's all we needed. Claire sighed heavily. He'll sign eventually. Nathan lowered his voice, but not enough. If Rebecca Sloan gets involved, she'll tear these documents apart. We need the competency ruling finished before the board meeting next week. My heart became perfectly still. Competency ruling. They weren't preparing for my future. They were preparing to erase me from it. I slipped back outside unnoticed, climbed into my truck, and sat there in complete silence. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and listened to the recording app that had been running since Nathan placed the leather portfolio on the table. For the first time since Evelyn died, I found myself whispering words I never thought I would say about my own daughter. I can't protect you from this anymore. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, and carried 2 mugs onto the front porch of the farmhouse Evelyn and I had built nearly 40 years earlier. Habit is a strange thing. Even after 6 years without her, I still poured 2 cups before remembering only one of us would drink it. I sat quietly, watching the morning fog roll across the fields, until my phone buzzed. The message contained only an address and a time. 7:30 a.m. Sloan's Diner, Booth 7. Rebecca Sloan had always believed important conversations happened best in places where nobody expected them. 30 minutes later, I walked into the small roadside diner just outside Pittsburgh. Rebecca was already waiting with a legal pad, 2 folders, and the same calm expression she had worn through 3 decades of lawsuits, business negotiations, and estate planning. She smiled as I approached. "You look tired." I slid into the booth across from her. "I am." She studied my face for a moment before asking the question she had probably rehearsed all morning. "Did they finally ask you to sign?" I nodded and placed the leather folder Nathan had given me onto the table. Rebecca opened it slowly, reading every page without saying a word. The waitress poured coffee, refilled our cups twice, and still Rebecca remained silent. Finally, she closed the folder, folded her hands together, and looked directly at me. "This isn't estate planning. I know. This is an attempt to remove you from every meaningful decision connected to the foundation." I nodded again. "I know that too." Rebecca pulled another document from her briefcase. "The neurologist whose signature appears here retired 14 months ago." She slid the paper toward me. "Whoever prepared these documents copied his signature from an older medical file." My jaw tightened, but I wasn't surprised anymore. Nathan had always believed confidence was enough to hide dishonesty. "There's more," Rebecca continued. She placed another folder on the table. This one marked Evelyn Carter Foundation Original Trust Agreement. "I reviewed the trust after your phone call last night. Do you remember Clause 14? I smiled faintly. "Every word." Rebecca smiled back. She had written that clause herself 21 years earlier at Evelyn's request. It was a paragraph so specific that almost everyone who read the trust considered it unnecessary. It stated that if the hospital's leadership knowingly abandoned its charitable mission, misused foundation assets, or attempted to obtain control through fraud or coercion, every executive authority would immediately revert to the original founder until an independent review could be completed. Nathan had clearly never bothered reading that far. He assumed ownership was controlled by titles and board votes. He never imagined Evelyn had insisted on protecting the hospital from exactly this kind of betrayal. Rebecca leaned forward. "William," she said quietly, "for 6 months you've watched. You've listened. You've gathered evidence. Last night they crossed the line." She paused before asking the question that changed everything. "Are you finally ready?" I looked through the diner window toward the rising sun. For years I had protected Claire from the consequences of her own choices. Every mistake had another explanation. Every warning received another chance. Every disappointment came with another excuse. But the woman who sat silently while her husband tried to steal her father's life's work wasn't the little girl who once promised her mother she would care for every patient who walked through those doors. Somewhere along the way, ambition had replaced compassion, and I could no longer tell where Nathan's influence ended and Claire's decisions began. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed my phone on the table. Rebecca pressed play. Nathan's voice filled the booth. "One signature. That's all we needed. We need the competency ruling finished before the board meeting next week." The recording ended. Rebecca slowly nodded. "That's enough to begin." "No, I replied. Not yet. She raised an eyebrow. There's still one piece missing. I removed a weathered envelope from my inside pocket, the same one I had carried with me every single day since Evelyn died. Her handwriting still covered the front. To be opened only if the hospital ever forgets why it was built. Rebecca stared at the envelope before looking back at me. You never opened it? I gently shook my head. She asked me to wait until the day I believed her dream was truly in danger. Rebecca exhaled slowly. And is today that day? I rested my hand on the envelope for several long seconds before answering. No. She looked surprised. Tomorrow is. Rebecca closed every folder on the table and stood up. Then tomorrow, she said quietly. We remind everyone who this hospital really belongs to. Neither of us noticed the man sitting alone in the corner booth, lowering his newspaper just enough to photograph the envelope in my hands before quietly walking out of the diner. The morning of the grand opening arrived, wrapped in perfect weather, exactly the kind of day newspapers love to photograph. Helicopters circled overhead, television crews lined the sidewalks, and luxury cars rolled one after another beneath the hospital's grand entrance. St. Evelyn Medical Center looked magnificent, but all I could see was the locked community care wing hidden behind polished walls and carefully rehearsed smiles. I reported for work at 6 o'clock, just like every other maintenance employee. Louise handed me a radio, a ring of master keys, and a work order for the VIP reception hall. Big day, he said with a tired grin. Let's hope nothing breaks. I smiled. Something always breaks. Neither of us knew how right those words would become. By mid-morning, the lobby was overflowing with donors, surgeons, politicians, and reporters eager to celebrate the hospital's opening. Claire moved through the crowd like she owned every inch of the building, stopping every few steps for another photograph or handshake. Nathan stayed close behind, introducing investors to board members, while quietly discussing expansion plans that had never been approved. As I polished fingerprints from the glass railing overlooking the main lobby, I overheard him speaking to a wealthy healthcare executive. Within 6 months, Nathan said confidently, we'll convert the unused East Wing into a premium executive wellness center. High-end cosmetic procedures, private recovery suites, concierge medicine. The margins will triple. The executive smiled. What about the charitable restrictions attached to the foundation? Nathan didn't hesitate. By next week, that won't be a problem anymore. My hand stopped moving. He wasn't guessing. He believed everything had already been secured. A few minutes later, I watched Claire step onto the main stage for a television interview. The reporter smiled warmly. This hospital has been called the realization of a lifelong family dream. What inspired you to create it? Claire never looked away from the camera. My mother believed healthcare should evolve with the future, she answered smoothly. My husband and I simply had the vision to make that future possible. There was no mention of Evelyn's final promise, no mention of the foundation, no mention of the thousands of construction workers, volunteers, nurses, or donors who had carried that dream for years. Most painfully of all, there was no mention of the father standing less than 30 feet away, quietly replacing a burned-out light bulb above the entrance. The interview ended with applause. Nathan leaned toward Claire and whispered something that made them both laugh. Then he handed her a black leather folder. I recognized it immediately. It was the same folder that had been sitting on their dining room table 3 nights earlier. Claire glanced through the pages before asking softly, "You're sure this is enough?" Nathan nodded. "Once the board votes this afternoon, your father won't be able to challenge anything. Legally, he'll just become a beneficiary with no authority." Claire hesitated for the first time all morning. "What if Rebecca shows up?" Nathan gave a quiet chuckle. "She won't. By the time she figures out what's happening, the paperwork will already be filed." He sounded so certain that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Around noon, Maya found me replacing ceiling tiles near the pediatric wing. She looked nervous. "William," she whispered, checking that no one else was nearby. "Someone from accounting has been asking for old maintenance records. They're specifically looking for security footage from the East Wing." "Did they say why?" She shook her head. "No, but one of them accidentally mentioned today's board meeting." Before I could answer, my radio crackled. "Maintenance to the donor reception. Immediate cleanup required." I thanked Maya and headed toward the ballroom, unaware that every step was carrying me toward the moment that would change all of our lives. Inside the reception hall, crystal glasses clinked together, while a string quartet played softly in the background. I quietly cleaned a spilled glass of champagne near the front row as Claire prepared to welcome the city's most influential guests. Just before she stepped onto the stage, one of the reporters asked a simple question. "Miss Carter, will your father be joining today's ceremony?" Claire forced a polite smile, but irritation flashed across her face for just a fraction of a second. "My father prefers staying out of the spotlight," she replied. "He's happier doing small jobs behind the scenes." Nathan added with a laugh, "Some people are simply more comfortable holding a mop than making decisions." Several guests laughed politely. I kept my eyes on the marble floor and continued wiping away the spilled champagne. Then Claire turned, finally noticing me standing only a few feet from the stage in my gray maintenance uniform. Her smile disappeared. She looked at the cameras, then at the investors waiting behind her, and without realizing the entire room had fallen silent, she pointed directly at me and said, "Can someone get the janitor out of here before he embarrasses us?" At that exact moment, the ballroom doors opened once again, and Rebecca Sloan walked in, carrying a sealed folder. No one in that room was prepared to see. Every conversation inside the ballroom stopped the moment Rebecca Sloan stepped through the entrance, carrying a thick, navy blue folder beneath one arm. Unlike everyone else in the room, she wasn't dressed for celebration. She wore the same charcoal suit she had worn in courtrooms for more than 30 years, and the expression on her face told me she hadn't come to congratulate anyone. Nathan noticed her first. The confidence that had followed him all morning disappeared almost instantly. "What is she doing here?" he whispered. Claire forced herself to smile as Rebecca approached the stage. "Rebecca," she said, extending a hand for the cameras. "I'm surprised you could make it." Rebecca ignored the gesture completely. Instead, she reached into her briefcase and handed a sealed envelope to the chairman of the hospital's board of trustees. "Before this ceremony continues," she said clearly enough for every microphone in the room to capture her words, "the board is legally required to review these documents." A murmur spread through the audience. The chairman looked confused. "Can this wait until after the ribbon cutting?" "No," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "By law, it cannot." Nathan stepped forward, his voice calm, but noticeably tighter than before. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. Today is a celebration, not a legal proceeding." Rebecca turned toward him. "Actually, Mr. Cole, today became a legal proceeding the moment you attempted to transfer authority using forged medical documents." The room went completely silent. Reporters immediately lowered their cameras from Claire and pointed them toward Rebecca. Nathan laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's a serious accusation." "Good," Rebecca answered. "Because I brought serious evidence." She nodded toward the chairman, who finally broke the seal and began reading the documents inside. The color slowly drained from his face. One board member leaned closer. Another removed his glasses and reread the first page. Within seconds, every trustee was studying the same file, while whispering urgently among themselves. Claire looked from one face to another. "What is happening?" she asked. Nobody answered. Rebecca finally turned toward the audience. "Many of you were invited here today to celebrate the vision behind St. Evelyn Medical Center." She paused. "Unfortunately, you've been celebrating the wrong people," Nathan immediately interrupted. "That's enough." "No," Rebecca replied. "We're just getting started." She pressed a button on a small remote, and the enormous presentation screen behind the stage flickered to life. Instead of architectural renderings and fundraising photographs, an old scanned document appeared. It was dated 22 years earlier. At the bottom of the page sat two signatures. One belonged to Evelyn Carter, the other belonged to William Carter. Rebecca looked around the room before speaking again. "This is the original trust agreement establishing the Evelyn Carter Foundation. It predates the hospital by nearly a decade." Another page appeared. Then another. Land deeds, construction contracts, charitable grants. Every document carried my name. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as people realized the quiet maintenance worker standing near the back wall wasn't simply an employee. He had been there from the very beginning. Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible." Rebecca calmly continued. "The land beneath this hospital was donated by William Carter. The construction funding came from the Evelyn Carter Foundation established by William Carter. The governing trust protecting this hospital was written under the direction of William Carter. She looked directly at Claire, and according to Clause 14 of that trust, she opened another folder and read aloud. Should any executive knowingly abandon the hospital's charitable purpose, misuse foundation assets, or obtain authority through fraud or coercion, all executive control shall immediately revert to the founding trustee until an independent review is completed. The final words echoed across the silent ballroom. Nathan's confidence vanished. That clause has never been enforced, he argued. Rebecca smiled for the first time all day. That's because no one had ever violated it before. She turned toward the chairman. Mr. Chairman, under the authority granted by the original trust, I formally request the immediate suspension of both Claire Carter and Nathan Cole pending a full forensic investigation. Before anyone could respond, another voice spoke from the back of the room. Motion seconded. Every head turned. It was Dr. Harold Benson, one of the hospital's oldest trustees, a man who had remained silent throughout the morning. He slowly stood up. I remember signing those original papers 20 years ago, he said. I also remember making a promise to Evelyn Carter that this hospital would never forget why it existed. He looked toward me. It appears we've broken that promise. One by one, other trustees stood as well. Nathan suddenly realized the room was slipping away from him. You can't do this, he shouted. We built this hospital. For the first time since the ceremony began, I stepped forward. I removed my gray maintenance gloves, folded them carefully, and placed them on the nearest table before speaking in a voice calm enough that every person in the ballroom leaned forward to hear it. No, Nathan. I looked directly into his eyes. You managed it. Then I turned toward Claire. Your mother and I built it. Tears immediately filled Claire's eyes, but they weren't enough to erase what had already happened. Rebecca reached into her briefcase one final time and removed the weathered envelope I had carried for years. There is one last piece of evidence, she said quietly. A letter written by Evelyn Carter before her death, to be opened only if this hospital ever forgot why it was built. The chairman slowly accepted the envelope. Every camera in the ballroom focused on his trembling hands as he unfolded the first page. No one breathed. No one moved. Because whatever Evelyn had written all those years ago was about to decide the future of everyone standing in that room. The chairman unfolded Evelyn's letter with hands that trembled just enough for everyone in the ballroom to notice. The room became so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. To whoever is reading this, he began, if this letter has been opened, then the promise William and I made together has already been broken. No one moved. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. This hospital was never meant to make our family important. It was built so people without money would never be treated as though their lives mattered less. If anyone, especially someone carrying my name, ever places wealth above compassion, I ask the board to protect this hospital. Even if that means protecting it from my own family. The final sentence hit Claire harder than any accusation Rebecca could have made. Tears rolled silently down her face as she stared at the familiar handwriting she hadn't seen since her mother's funeral. Nathan, however, showed no emotion. His eyes weren't fixed on the letter. They were locked on the folders Rebecca had placed before the trustees. He understood something the rest of the room hadn't realized yet. The letter was emotional. The documents were dangerous. Rebecca closed the letter carefully before turning toward the chairman. Everything you've heard today explains why this investigation began, she said. What you're about to see explains why it cannot stop. She handed another file to every member of the board. This one was considerably thicker. Across the front appeared a single title in bold black letters, Independent Financial Audit. Nathan's jaw tightened. That report isn't official. Rebecca didn't even look at him. It is now. Before she could continue, another voice echoed from the back of the ballroom. She's telling the truth. Every head turned toward an older man walking slowly down the center aisle carrying 3 cardboard archive boxes. His name was Paul Reyes. I recognized him immediately. He had served as the hospital's senior accountant for nearly 12 years before suddenly disappearing from the staff directory. Nathan's expression changed for the first time that day. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Paul placed the boxes on the nearest table and looked directly at the board. I was fired 8 months ago, he said calmly, because I refused to approve transfers that didn't exist. Nathan stepped forward. He's a disgruntled former employee. Paul nodded. You're right. Then he opened the first box. That's why I kept copies. The room erupted into whispers as hundreds of financial records, invoices, bank transfers, vendor contracts, and payment authorizations covered the table. Rebecca selected several documents and projected them onto the large screen behind the stage. Every payment appeared legitimate until she enlarged one small detail. The receiving companies all had different names, but identical mailing addresses. Another page appeared, then another, different vendors, same address, another transfer, another company, same address again. Rebecca spoke slowly enough that everyone could follow. Over the last 3 years, approximately $23 million intended for charitable care was redirected through 6 shell corporations. She clicked once more. Corporate registration records filled the screen. Each company listed a different owner. Then Rebecca highlighted one final line. Every corporation had been created by the same attorney, representing the same client, Nathan Cole. Audible gasps swept across the ballroom. One television reporter quietly whispered, "Oh my God." Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. "Nathan," she said weakly, "tell me this isn't real." Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for Claire's hand. "Listen to me. They're twisting normal business transactions." Rebecca interrupted him before he could continue. "Would you also like me to explain the forged neurological evaluation?" Nathan froze. Rebecca produced another document. "The physician whose signature appears on your competency petition retired 14 months before this report was supposedly written." She placed another page beside it. "And here's the forensic analysis, confirming the signature was copied electronically." Claire slowly stepped backward, as if the floor beneath her had disappeared. "You told me the doctors examined my father." Nathan finally raised his voice. "Because they were supposed to." The words escaped before he could stop them. Silence crashed over the ballroom. Nathan immediately realized what he had admitted. Claire looked at him as though she were seeing a stranger for the first time. "You lied to me," she whispered. Nathan grabbed her arm. "Claire, listen." She pulled away. "Did you steal that money?" He hesitated. "Just 1 second." But 1 second was enough. Claire's shoulders collapsed. "Answer me." Nathan looked around the room, searching for anyone still willing to stand beside him. There was no one. The investors who had praised him only an hour earlier quietly stepped away. The trustees avoided his eyes. Even the photographers stopped asking questions and simply kept recording. Then the ballroom doors opened once again. This time it wasn't another lawyer or board member. 2 federal investigators entered alongside uniformed officers carrying official credentials. The lead investigator walked directly toward the chairman before speaking in a calm, unmistakable voice. "We've been monitoring this investigation for several months. Based on the evidence submitted this morning, we are executing federal warrants related to wire fraud, charitable asset diversion, financial conspiracy, and document forgery." Nathan's face turned completely pale, but the greatest shock was still waiting. As one investigator opened the final archive box, he looked toward Claire and quietly said, "Miss Carter, there's something in here you need to see before anyone else does." No one in the ballroom spoke as the federal investigator lifted a thin black folder from the final archive box and walked directly toward Claire. Unlike the financial records scattered across the tables, this folder contained only a handful of documents. The investigator placed it gently in her hands. "You deserve to read these yourself." Claire looked confused as she opened the cover. The first page was an employment agreement. The second was a confidential compensation package. The third was a contract scheduled to take effect 30 days after the hospital's sale to the private healthcare corporation. Then she reached the final page, and the color disappeared from her face. It was a severance agreement, already prepared in her name. If the acquisition went through, Nathan would become chief executive officer of the newly privatized hospital. Claire would be removed from her position, stripped of every voting privilege, and quietly dismissed with a financial settlement designed to keep her from challenging the transaction. Her signature had already been copied onto the final page, waiting only for the closing date to be entered. Claire looked up at Nathan, unable to hide the disbelief in her voice. "You were planning to fire me?" Nathan didn't answer. He couldn't. Every explanation he searched for died the moment he looked into her eyes. "After everything I did," she whispered. "After standing against my own father." Her voice broke before she could finish the sentence. Nathan finally stepped toward her. "Claire, listen to me. Things changed. The investors wanted stronger leadership. She stared at him as if she had never truly known the man standing in front of her. "No," she said quietly. "You wanted complete control." One of the federal agents moved beside Nathan. "Mr. Cole, I'd advise you not to say anything further until you've spoken with legal counsel." Nathan ignored him. His attention remained fixed on Claire. "You don't understand how business works." Claire slowly shook her head. "No. I finally understand exactly how you work." The words cut deeper than any courtroom verdict ever could. The lead investigator signaled to his team, and they began collecting computers, financial records, and storage devices from the executive offices, while stunned employees watched from the hallway. Reporters rushed outside to broadcast breaking news. Within minutes, every major local station interrupted its programming. The same cameras that had arrived expecting to celebrate a successful grand opening were now reporting one of the largest charitable fraud investigations in the state's history. Phones rang non-stop throughout the ballroom. Investors quietly informed the board they were suspending every pending agreement until the investigation concluded. Several physicians who had remained silent for years finally stepped forward, admitting they had questioned financial decisions but had been warned not to challenge Nathan's authority. The carefully built image of perfect leadership collapsed piece by piece, not because of one dramatic revelation, but because frightened people no longer had a reason to stay silent. Through all of it, I remained standing near the back of the room, watching the daughter I had once carried on, my shoulders struggle beneath the weight of choices she could no longer blame on anyone else. I wasn't celebrating. There was nothing joyful about watching your own child discover that ambition had cost her almost everything that truly mattered. Claire slowly walked toward me, her eyes swollen with tears. The crowd instinctively stepped aside, creating a path neither of us had expected to walk. When she finally stopped in front of me, she couldn't lift her head. "Dad," she whispered. I knew about the money being moved. My heart sank, but I stayed silent. Nathan told me it was temporary. He said we'd replace it after the expansion. I wanted to believe him because every quarter the numbers looked better, and every award made me feel like I was making Mom proud. She looked at the hospital surrounding us before continuing. Then it became easier not to ask questions. Tears fell freely onto the marble floor. When you started working here, I should have asked why. Instead, I worried about what people would think if they saw you wearing that uniform. She finally looked up at me. I'm ashamed of myself. Before I could answer, reporters surged forward, microphones extended toward my face. "Mr. Carter," one shouted, "do you have a statement about your daughter's role in the investigation?" Another called out, "Will you demand criminal charges against her?" Dozens of cameras waited for the moment everyone expected the betrayed father publicly destroying the daughter, who had humiliated him only hours earlier. I looked at Claire for a long moment before turning toward the reporters. "My daughter will answer for every decision she made," I said calmly. "That's what accountability means." The cameras moved closer. I continued. "But I won't turn the worst day of her life into entertainment. Justice doesn't need humiliation to be complete." The room fell silent once again. Even the reporters lowered their microphones. Claire covered her face as quiet sobs escaped between trembling hands. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she wasn't crying because she had lost her position, her reputation, or her future. She was crying because the man she had failed so completely had just shown her more grace than she believed she deserved. As federal agents escorted Nathan toward the exit, he glanced back one final time, expecting Claire to follow him. She didn't move. She never looked at him again. Outside, flashing emergency lights reflected across the hospital windows, while news helicopters circled overhead. Inside, the board voted unanimously to remove Nathan permanently, suspend Claire pending the outcome of the investigation, and restore full authority to the Evelyn Carter Foundation. Everyone believed the story had finally reached its ending. They were wrong. Because before the sun rose the following morning, Claire would make one final decision that neither I nor anyone else inside that hospital ever saw coming. Before sunrise the next morning, I returned to St. Evelyn Medical Center long before the reporters, television crews, and curious onlookers gathered outside the gates again. The building looked completely different without flashing cameras and polished speeches. Nurses hurried through the lobby carrying coffee instead of posing for photographs. Patients checked in quietly, unaware they had walked into the center of yesterday's headlines. For the first time in years, the hospital felt like a place built to heal instead of impress. As I unlocked the maintenance office to return my radio and master keys, I noticed someone already waiting inside. Claire. She wasn't wearing her tailored business suit anymore. The expensive jewelry was gone. Her designer handbag had been replaced by a plain canvas tote resting beside her chair. She looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept for days instead of one night. When I stepped into the room, she immediately stood. "Dad," she began, but the words refused to come. I quietly placed my keys on the desk and waited. After nearly a minute, she finally managed to speak. "I drove here at 4 this morning because I knew if I waited until later, I'd lose the courage." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time she didn't hide them. "Yesterday wasn't the day I lost my job." She swallowed hard. "It was the day I realized I lost myself a long time ago." I remained silent. Some apologies deserve to be heard without interruption. Claire slowly reached into her bag and removed the gold executive identification badge she had worn with such pride only 24 hours earlier. She laid it carefully on the desk between us. "This doesn't belong to me anymore." Then she placed another item beside it. It was the small hospital pin her mother had given her on the day construction first began. "I don't deserve this either." I picked up the pin and turned it over in my hand. On the back, Evelyn had engraved 4 simple words: "People before profit." Claire lowered her head. "I used to read those words every morning," her voice cracked. "Then one day, I stopped seeing them." At that moment, Rebecca entered the room carrying a folder. "The board reached a decision," she said. "Nathan was formally charged overnight. Every fraudulent contract has been frozen. The charitable assets have been secured, and the community care wing can reopen within 30 days. Claire closed her eyes in relief, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "The board also voted unanimously to remove you as chief executive officer." Claire nodded. "I expected that." Rebecca looked toward me before continuing. "However, they left one final decision entirely in William's hands." The room became very quiet. Claire looked at me but said nothing. She knew I could spend years fighting her in court if I wanted. I could remove her from the foundation forever. I could ensure she never worked in healthcare again. After everything that had happened, no one would have questioned me. Instead, I walked to the supply closet, opened the door, and took out a folded housekeeping uniform identical to the one I had worn every day for the past 6 months. Beside it hung a pair of work gloves and a simple identification badge with no title beneath the name. I handed them to Claire. She looked at the uniform, confused. "What is this?" "Your new beginning," I answered quietly. She stared at me, unable to understand. I continued, "The board has approved a volunteer rehabilitation program for employees who want to earn back the community's trust. It starts today." Claire looked down at the uniform in her hands. "You want me to clean the hospital?" I gently shook my head. "No." She looked back up. "I want you to serve the people this hospital was built for. Some days that will mean cleaning a floor. Some days it will mean delivering meals, changing bed linens, pushing wheelchairs, or simply sitting beside someone who has nobody else." I paused before adding the words Evelyn would have spoken herself. "There is no shame in honest work. The shame comes from believing you're too important to do it." Claire's shoulders began to shake. She clutched the folded uniform against her chest and quietly whispered, "I'll do whatever it takes." 30 days later, the Evelyn Carter Community Care Wing reopened exactly as my wife had imagined decades earlier. The first patient through its doors was an elderly widower who apologized because he couldn't afford treatment. Claire knelt beside him, smiled gently, and said, "You don't have to worry about that here." I watched from the hallway without saying a word. She had finally remembered the promise her mother asked us to keep. Months later, reporters returned, hoping for another dramatic interview. Instead, they found me repairing a loose handrail outside the children's garden, while Claire helped a volunteer carry blankets into the community care wing. One reporter asked whether I had forgiven my daughter. I smiled, tightened the final bolt with my wrench, and answered, "Forgiveness isn't something you announce. It's something you build, one honest day at a time." As I walked away, sunlight reflected across the bronze letters above the entrance, St. Evelyn Medical Center, and for the first time since Evelyn left this world, I looked at her name without feeling heartbreak. I felt peace. Because buildings can be stolen, titles can be taken away, fortunes can disappear overnight, but the values we choose to live by become the only legacy that time can never erase. And if there's one lesson my family learned, it's this: the strongest foundations are never poured in concrete. They're built in character, strengthened by humility, and remembered through kindness long after every spotlight fades.